Hi, my name is Marcy Karen. Among other things, I direct the Legislation and Civil Rights Clinic and chair the Clinical Affairs Committee at the University of the District of Columbia, David A. Clark School of Law. UDC Law is an HBCU located in our nation's capital that requires all part-time students to take at least 10 credits and all full-time students to take 14 credits of clinical education. A few years ago, we created this series as a way for faculty who teach in UDC clinics to engage with other leaders in experiential learning from around the country to further advance our collective pedagogy and practice and to think about pressing issues facing our community. I'm confident that today's conversation is going to accomplish those goals, and I'm excited to introduce my relatively new colleague, Professor Jocelyn Cazares Willingham, who co-directs our Immigration and Human Rights Clinic, who will be in conversation with Professor Faiza Syed of Brooklyn Law School. A few preliminary matters before I turn things over. First, our plan is for the conversation between our experts to last for approximately 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Typically, we keep cameras off for this first part and then come on screen for the audience Q&A. Second, a friendly reminder that we are recording today's session and the video will be posted online afterwards. So with that, thank you all for joining us today as we kick off season 4 of UDC Law's Conversations with Clinicians. I'm going to turn things over to Professor Cazares Willingham now, but then ask that you both start with a quick introduction to your clinics before digging into best practices related to clinics as government watchdogs.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you, Professor Karen, for that introduction, and Professor Syed for joining us in this conversation. Just to briefly describe where the background I'm coming from is I co-direct the Immigration and Human Rights Clinic, where we mainly represent individuals facing removal defense or seeking affirmative processes with USCIS. In various immigration matters, but primarily humanitarian protection claims. But we additionally try to build in some international human rights work, given that we are in DC and have access to the commission here. With that, I'll go ahead and turn the mic over to our wonderful guest.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So I am Faiza Syed, and I direct the Safe Harbor Clinic at Brooklyn Law School. And the Safe Harbor Clinic is Brooklyn Law School's immigration clinic, and we have a combined advocacy model for the clinic. So students work on different types of projects. Some students work on projects directly representing immigrants and humanitarian immigration applications, such as asylum. But other students will engage in broader community empowerment projects or projects aimed at achieving some sort of systemic immigration reform, such as the report that we're going to talk about today.
And so with that, I would love to delve in a little bit into your report. So the Safe Harbor Clinic published this very telling report of fiefdom on Long Island, an investigation into the culture and practices of the New York Asylum Office that exposed a culture of fear, stress, urgency within the New York Asylum Office that has resulted in asylum seekers with legitimate claims being placed in removal proceedings rather than being granted relief. Can you walk us through what inspired this project and what it revealed about the New York Asylum as a whole?
Yes, I'm going to try to be succinct because I can go on for a really long time about this. In terms of what inspired the project, I really had two experiences that motivated me to do this report. First, before becoming a clinician, I did practice immigration law in New York for a number of years, and it was really well known among the New York immigration community of, I should say, New York immigration attorney community, that the New York Asylum Office was a very challenging place, sort of across the board in terms of its very remote location. It was challenging for asylum seekers and attorneys to get there in terms of how aggressive and adversarial asylum officers could be, in terms of how much the office limits the role of attorneys, and the lack of transparency at the asylum office. My second, more unique experience was I actually worked as a refugee officer for USCIS. very briefly. And refugee officers, of course, are the asylum officer counterpart. ROs interview and adjudicate cases of people abroad who are seeking to resettle in the United States. But we are trained side by side with asylum officers. So I met a lot of asylum officers through that experience. And I had the extraordinary bad luck of starting this job at the tail end of the Obama administration and into the Trump administration. So you probably recall one of the first things President Trump did was shut down all refugee processing. And so refugee officers were detailed to asylum offices across the country. But we were given some choice in which asylum office we were detailed to. And everyone knew not to rank the New York asylum office as a place they would be willing to be detailed, because even within USCIS, the New York asylum office had a really bad reputation in terms of the workplace culture. So the asylum officers there, more than asylum officers at other asylum offices, were really overworked, stressed, and extremely unhappy. So that was the background I was coming from. No one had attempted to sort of document the very long-standing issues at the New York Asylum Office. And I do have to give credit to Professor Anna Welch from the University of Maine School of Law, because she, with her clinic students, wrote a report on the Boston Asylum Office in 2022. And that was like the immediate inspiration, because when she sent the report out to all of the advocate listservs, an attorney from Human Rights First replied all and said, "Great, someone do New York next." And I said, "Now's the time. I've been wanting to do this and I'm going to do it." So in terms of the report's major findings, what we did, our investigation had one big question, and that was, why does the New York Asylum Office consistently have one of the lowest or the lowest asylum grant rate in the country? So it had dropped to a grant rate of 5%. In 2020, it's inched up a little, but it's still the lowest grant rate across the country. And so we ended up interviewing former New York asylum officers, immigration attorneys, asylum seekers about their experiences, either representing someone or being interviewed or conducting the interviews. And what we found out was actually that, asylum officers at the New York Asylum Office are under really extraordinary pressure to interview and adjudicate cases as quickly as possible. And because of those time pressures, they are referring more than they are granting. And crucially, they are referring individuals who have valid asylum claims. And the reason this is happening is asylum officers over and over explain to us that it is easier to refer an individual to immigration court than it is to grant asylum. And that's simply because to grant asylum, you have to gather more information from the asylum seeker. You have to write a more detailed decision. And often asylum officers who are writing grants were getting their grants turned back to them by supervisors. Supervisors were asking them to write more justification or even re-interview applicants. And they said that was like a punishment because it meant less time to adjudicate and interview other cases. And so they were really being sort of pushed, not directly, they weren't being told to refer, but because of the time pressures, because of the attitude of supervisors towards grants, they were being encouraged in that way to refer more than to grant. And often the way they were referring, they explained to us the quickest way to refer is by finding the asylum seeker not credible, rather. And so they were conducting these very adversarial and aggressive interviews where they were trying to find inconsistencies in the applicant's testimony to refer them based on credibility. I could go on, but I'm going to stop there.
I think that gives a great overview. And I will just say on a personal note, as someone who started off doing asylum work in New York and had my first case as a student in New York, I felt very validated reading that report because I remember being so confused as to how some of the cases we were taking up had been referred over to the court. And I think that report really just aptly summarized a lot of the things we within the field were feeling, but didn't have any empirical data or qualitative data to support our feelings. So I do really want to thank you for that endeavor and your students. One of the things as I was reading it is that I, as a clinician, and now wondering is, whether to conduct investigations into the effectiveness of government agencies is a really difficult decision, right? Because, some clinicians may be really concerned or deterred from doing this work out of a concern of the risk that it may impart on ourselves as the clinicians, on our students and our clients, right? Did you have any of these concerns when beginning this work and the investigation, and how it may impact the clinic that you direct, yourself, your students, and your clients?
Yes, this is such a good question. I actually agonized about this for a little bit. Um, I and my students do represent asylum seekers in front of the New York Asylum Office, and also my colleagues do. So Professor Susan Hazeldine, who runs our LGBT advocacy clinic, Professor Stacey Kaplow, who is here, both represent clients before the New York Asylum Office. So I wasn't just worried about our clients, I was also concerned about their clients. Ultimately, we decided to go forward because the question I just kept coming back to was, if not us, then who, right? Who else can do this project in terms of who else has the time and the resources to commit to this investigation, and who else can take on the risk, or rather, for whom is the risk the smallest? I knew from practicing immigration law a couple different nonprofits in the New York City area that immigration attorneys have massive caseloads, which makes it really hard for them to dedicate any time to work outside of just simply representing asylum seekers. I used to be one of those, so I knew that it would be unlikely that an immigration attorney could take on this project. In terms of risk, legal service organizations represent far more asylum seekers than I do as a clinician, and they are far more frequently appearing before the New York Asylum Office than I am. And many of these organizations have worked for years to cultivate a relationship with the specific directors. In comparison, as a clinician, I have a very small caseload, and I have the luxury of dedicating a year or more. We spent more than a year actually on this investigation. I was also able to assign a team of 3 students who worked exclusively on this project during their time in the clinic. And ultimately, I decided it was also a lot less risky for me to take on this project. I had 3 cases pending before the New York Asylum Office when we decided to take on this project. All 3 are stuck in the backlog, and so they're not likely to be interviewed for years. In addition, I have the luxury of choosing my cases, and so I did make the decision to not take any new asylum cases before the New York Asylum Office. And I knew, legal service organizations don't have all of these luxuries that I have. And I think the fact that the office has been so problematic for so long, but no one has attempted to document it, is really telling that really no one was willing to take the risk. And I should note that we actually did work on this project with 2 partner organizations, but you'll notice the project was published just under Safe Harbor's name. And that was because our partner organizations are major players in the immigration world, and they ultimately decided they wanted to take a behind the scenes role and not to have their names published, prominently on the report or at all on the report. At first when they told us this, the students and I were a little disappointed, but ultimately it just underscored to us how clinics are really uniquely positioned to take on this type of work.
Thank you. And I think it's clear that there was a lot of different things that you built into the investigation, and even before making the decision to kind of alleviate some of the risks that could come from it. But I'm curious, since it has now been published and been out for a couple of months, if there's any type of repercussions or responses that you've received since its publication.
Yeah, so no. The short answer to that is no. I have not had the opportunity to go before the New York Asylum Office since we published. Again, our three cases are stuck in the backlog, so I don't imagine we'll be there in a number of years. It was really important for us to give the New York Asylum Office director and the director of the entire asylum program an opportunity to respond to our findings. And so before we published, we emailed both Patricia Menges, who is the director of the New York Asylum Office, and John Lafferty, who's the director of the entire asylum program. And we told them, like, we're doing this investigation. These are our findings. We'd love to meet with you and, talk to you about them and, hear from you, your perspective. Patricia Menges never responded. John Lafferty did. He responded actually pretty quickly, I believe because he found out about an event we were holding at the law school to unveil sort of the report. And he asked for a copy of the report. At the time that he emailed, we were not yet ready. It wasn't fully finalized. And so I ended up giving him a very detailed summary and reiterating our request to meet, and he didn't respond. After the report was published, we sent it to both of them and we still have not heard from them. Also, after we published, advocates sent sort of an advocate's letter to director of the entire USCIS, Urjadu, where they basically just said that our report was, consistent with their collective experiences before the New York Asylum Office, and where they also demanded some changes. As far as I know, Urjadu has not responded to the advocates, but I am really happy that they sent that letter because I do think she should be aware of it. So, no negative or positive reactions yet.
Okay, but it does really highlight, what you said earlier. There is this culture. It seems like it's known, yet it's
Yeah.
out to continue to operate. So I think that the title of the fiefdom is it's really aptly chosen there. I think you've already started talking through us a little bit of how you decided to structure this to alleviate the risks that may come from the report. And I think another aspect that would be really helpful for us to learn as clinicians who are very interested in engaging, giving our students as much broad opportunities in advocacy work is learning how you structured it so that they could actually take the lead in a lot of the development of the report.
Yeah, absolutely. So I will say this was my first time working with students on a project like this. I mostly have worked with students on directly representing asylum seekers. So it was certainly a learning experience for me. Ultimately, I ended up not taking a very different approach than I normally take. So, as with all my students, I wanted them to have some foundation in asylum law. So they attended my Asylum 101 lecture where I tried to tell them all the nuances of asylum law in just 2 hours. And then my partner organizations and I also thought it was important for the students to read the asylum officer training lesson plans so that they had some idea of what the process is supposed to look like, what USCIS claims is supposed to happen in an affirmative asylum interview, how asylum officers are supposed to behave, what the role of an attorney is supposed to be like. But that's really the only foundation they got going into it. In terms of actually working on the case, I always tend to be very non-directive, and I took that same approach. So the students were the ones who, they took the initial stab at drafting our interview templates. So we had 3 separate interview templates for asylum officers, asylum seekers, immigration attorneys. They drafted the FOIA. I, of course, provided extensive feedback, as I always do. And then what was unique about this project is usually the feedback ends with me. In this case, we had 2 partner organizations. And so once they went through the round of feedback from me, we would always send everything to our partner organizations. In terms of the actual interviews, as I said, students had the interview templates. During the interviews, I let the students lead the interviewing. At the initial interviews, I was present. But later on in the project, I let the students do interviews on their own. They were recorded and transcribed. because the students really became the experts and they knew exactly what to ask. And then, sorry, I'm recovering from a cold. In terms of actually writing the report, that's where the students really got to be creative. And they did look at other human rights reports, and we brainstormed a lot about how to structure the report. Ultimately, the students really wanted to take a bit of a different approach. They really wanted the report to be something that any layperson could pick up and follow, and also something that they would want to read. And so they wanted the writing to be very engaging. And the structure that they took for the report was really something they thought a lot about. They decided to sort of walk the reader through the experience of an asylum seeker first, because they wanted to center the experience of the asylum seekers. So the report begins with asylum seekers attempting to get to this remote location, their experiences with security guards. And then about halfway through, it switches perspectives to the perspective of the asylum officers. And in that way, the reader ends the report by realizing that this office is actually not working for anyone. It's not working for asylum seekers, immigration attorneys, or the office's own asylum officers.
Yeah, thank you for actually explaining that, because I did notice that and I was wondering how that was developed. And it's really fascinating to hear how much your students really took full reins of this approach. I am curious, given that you stated that prior to this, it was really a focus on direct representation work, how your students responded to kind of a very different form of advocacy and what you found they drew from that experience.
Yeah, so the students were really, really excited about this project. So every year we have, when we select students, all of the clinics sort of present before students apply. And at that initial sort of meeting, I had told students, like, one of the projects this year that you'll get to work on is a human rights report. And we don't have a human rights clinic at Brooklyn Law School. And so there, students who wanted to do that type of work were really excited. And so, I was a bit unsure, because usually students really want to represent someone, but students were really excited to take on this type of advocacy, particularly because this type of work is really hard to break into. So doing this type of work as a legal internship, for example, there are not very many organizations that do this type of work. They probably have a handful of interns. Doing this type of work right out of law school is also really difficult. And so the students were so excited to, and so grateful to be able to have this opportunity while they were still in law school. In terms of what they took from it, they did develop those interviewing skills because they were interviewing. They actually conducted over 40 interviews. They also got to learn about systemic inefficiencies and inequities in the immigration system or the asylum system that don't always come through when you're just working on one individual case. So I think they learned actually, they built and learned quite a bit from doing this sort of different project.
Yeah, I definitely makes sense to me. And it's reassuring too, as someone who wants to engage in all different types of work, to hear that there's all these skills that we get from direct representation work that can still happen here in this more, larger picture type of advocacy work. The other aspect that I'm really curious to hear a little bit more, and it sounds like part of the key components that you had was two ally organizations that could really help you identify sources. But I don't want to presume anything here. So I would love if, for clinicians who are maybe thinking of doing this in the future, to get a little bit of insight of how your students were able to identify these sources and get them to agree to these interviews.
Yeah. I will say, actually, the students did most of the work here. They did a lot of research. So in terms of immigration attorneys, that was the group that was easiest for us to contact. I know a lot, just because I practiced here, I know a lot of the immigration attorneys, so I suggested some names. And then they also scoured the internet themselves, looked at organization websites, read bios to see who might be someone who has experience before the New York Asylum Office. They then individually emailed attorneys and invited them to do the interviews. And for every attorney that we spoke to, they also asked those attorneys, is there anyone else you think we should speak to? And we got some names that way. In terms of former asylum officers, again, there were a few people that I knew personally who had previously worked at the asylum office, so we started there. A number of the former asylum officers actually ended up connecting us to their former colleagues. We also did, a little bit of internet sleuthing, on LinkedIn and to find people who formerly worked at the asylum office. Asylum seekers were also actually the hardest group to track down. We ended up asking every single immigration attorney that we spoke to if they had clients who would be willing to speak to us. And I will say most attorneys were very, very protective and reluctant to connect to us to their clients. They were understandably very concerned about re-traumatization. And so we made sure to let them know we weren't going to be asking about the substance of the claim, just about their experience before the asylum office. So we were able to interview a handful of asylum seekers who were connected, whose names and information were given to us through their attorneys. In terms of how we got people to speak to us, the students were really thoughtful and intentional about this. They ended up drafting like a confidentiality, like sort of statement. It was not like an agreement that we sign and that they sign. We were hesitant to have anyone sign anything because we thought that people might get freaked out. And we kept the statement sort of brief because we also didn't want to burden people with, really long documents to read. For a few people, one person in particular comes to mind, a former asylum officer. They wanted to chat with us before committing. And so we had a meeting where the students talked to them and pitched the project and convinced them and sort of addressed their concerns. We did promise everyone confidentiality in that we said we would not use names or identifying information in the report. So all of the names in the report are pseudonyms we made up. We promised to be very careful with their anecdotes and not to sort of reveal too much that might identify them, particularly with the former asylum officers who were really, really afraid to be, identified. We did have some interviewees who did not want to be recorded, and we honored that request, and we ended up having one student try to transcribe the interview in the moment for accuracy's purposes, but all other interviewees did agree. I was quite surprised and happy to be recorded. And we explained, this recording is not going to anyone. It's just for us. It'll be used internally just for purposes of accuracy. And I think that alleviated a lot of people's concerns.
It really does sound that your students engaged in a lot of skill development, including fact investigation and getting someone to agree to a very difficult conversation or interview. And so I can see why you did this, and it really does encourage me to consider more how I can have my students engage in this type of work. So given that, I'd love to hear from you about any tips or any guidance you have to share for clinicians who are considering how they can have their students serve these types of functions.
Yeah, I do have a couple of tips. First and foremost, this project took a long time. So we ended up working on it for 2 semesters and the summer. And so if you are a 1-semester clinic, you may want to just consider taking on students for this report for a year and getting them to commit to it. I think for me, this project was really great because the 3 students were extraordinary and they agreed, all 3 of them agreed to work on it in the fall and into the spring. One student worked on it through the summer and the fall, this past fall as well. And that sort of continuity really helped. our very first semester working on this project was really just getting basic things ready. So our interview templates, writing and drafting our FOIA, investigating who to interview, making interview lists, emailing interviews. We actually didn't start any of the interviewing. Well, I think we might have done a little bit of interviewing in the fall, but most of our interviews happened in the spring. And so they were doing a lot of work in the spring. And the writing happened in the spring and over the summer. And then we ended up also over the summer hiring a student to help with, fact checking. And so definitely think about this as like a long-term project and plan for it. The other thing that I wish I had been a little bit more sort of thoughtful about was sort of what does the post-publication advocacy look like and how to involve the students in it. During the semesters, the students and I did talk about it, but we were so just like caught up with just interviewing people and so busy with that what ended up happening is after publication, we published in the fall. I also happened to be on research leave in the fall, and so I didn't have students working with me. And so most of that post publication advocacy, and I'm talking about, meeting with Congress people, meeting with journalists, I ended up doing mostly on my own. And that was a shame because I really think that type of advocacy is important for students to learn. And so in retrospect, I might have, I don't know, put off my research leave, I don't know, maybe to let students sort of get that experience as well.
That makes sense, especially I think we were talking about earlier, this type of project is really hard to break into. I think another aspect that's really hard to break into is all that media advocacy work that you really don't start doing most of the time as a practitioner until many, many years of practice.
Yes.
So that's a really helpful lesson learned to share with us. Thank you for that. I think I would, as my second to last question, I would be really remiss as an immigration clinician and a former practitioner that exclusively did removal defense work, not to spend some explicit time really appreciating the work that you and your students did in shedding this light into the systemic issue in the New York Asylum Office. And so one of the things I just wanted to highlight, I was shocked about, not that it existed, but that you actually agreed, you actually convinced an asylum officer to admit, right, that they had referred a case, not because they thought it didn't deserve a grant, but because it was just easier to do so than to continue to fight for that grant. I'm curious, is there anything in your investigation with your students that shocked you about the findings of this report?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely that shocked us and so much shocked us. But one thing that I do want to highlight is also something that asylum officers admitted to us. There was this sort of feeling among the asylum officers that because their decisions are not final, in that because asylum seekers can have their cases reviewed by an immigration judge, and because in the New York immigration courts, there are really high grant rates, that their decisions were, I don't want to say not, I feel like what they were essentially telling us was like their decisions were not really a big deal because at the end of the day, the asylum officer gets to go before an immigration judge and they're have high grant rates in New York and they're likely going to be granted. And there was sort of no acknowledgement of the fact that that takes years and that is incredibly traumatizing, and it leads to prolonged family separation. It leads to family members in harm. It leads to asylum seekers basically living in limbo for years. And, justice delayed is truly justice denied. And so I was really shocked and surprised, and it made me question just like, how can we have a system where that doesn't happen, where asylum officers truly understand the consequences of their decisions and don't just punt things to the immigration court? Because that's really what we felt like was happening. We even had an asylum officer say, I thought, what, let's just let the immigration judge figure out if it's all a lie. And so that was pretty shocking to me because as someone who represents asylum seekers, I know how terrible it is for an asylum seeker to be referred.
Thank you for highlighting that there is a huge emotional, psychological, and family cost to this delay. I do think that the report did an excellent job highlighting that. I think we will go on to we'll soon go on to questions from the audience, but before we get to those, I would like to end with giving you the opportunity to share with us what you hope people's responses are to this report.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I hope will happen as a result of the report. First, now that we've actually documented the problems at the New York Asylum Office, I really truly hope and have been encouraging advocates to use the report in immigration court. So if your client has been referred by the New York Asylum Office, particularly on because of a credibility issue, submit our report to the judge to contextualize your client's experience, because so many judges, when they see a referral based on credibility, they take it very seriously. And so this really can help the judge understand why that's happening and why that shouldn't be held against the asylum seeker necessarily. My other hope also is that Congresspeople, senators start asking questions. And so we were able to meet with Representative Jayapal's and Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office about our report. And I'm hoping that they are going to start asking USCIS some tough questions about the report so that they can't easily brush the report under the rug, right? I think they're going to be much more responsive to the representatives than they have been to us. Finally, I think our main hope is to truly see some change at the New York Asylum Office. And we did hear a rumor that the director may be retiring soon. And so we're hopeful that they will be encouraged to appoint someone very different to the asylum office who can sort of reform that culture of fear and referral that exists at that office.
I hope for all those things too, and I think it's an excellent suggestion for advocates in the New York area who are representing individuals who have been referred to submit those reports. So thank you for highlighting that. I would love to take another moment to really thank you for joining us. It was really such a joy to learn from you and your students and the work that you've done. And I hope that this starts and inspires clinicians to think about how we can engage in more similar work in different ways. I know it has for me. Professor Karen, I think.
Yeah, I'm just going to echo everything that my lovely colleague just said, and just thank you for sharing the work of the Safe Harbor Clinic. It's such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. To remind everyone that the recording for this session is going to be posted along with the list of past episodes on UDC's website. Our next session is scheduled for April 19th at 12:30 p.m. when I'm going to be in conversation with Professor Marcia Griggs of St. Louis University School of Law, who is also president-elect of the Association of Academic Support Educators. And we're going to be talking about how we can better leverage clinics as a bar success tool. The registration link is in the chat. Faiza, I hope you feel better and that your cough goes away. And thank you, Jocelyn, and everyone for joining us. And have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.